of Iraq. I always say that the Middle East finds itself in a continuous cycle of missed opportunities. The world has watched the Tashrin movement in Iraq, which called for freedom, women like freedom in Iran, and the 17th October the protest that he was talking about in terms of fighting corruption. So we actually live in a very interesting moment because Hezbollah right now is at weakest, and in more than a decade. And Ayatollah Sistani, which is separate than Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, has called for dismantling of all militias and strengthening the states of both Iraq and Lebanon, offering a very unique opening, which I think it's a time to seize the moment. It's a time for the German government, the United States government, of course, and the international community to consider some of the recommendations that I have built over the time. The first thing is strengthening state institutions. We live in a normal country. What is the definition of a normal country? Normal country is when there is an actual rule of law that is implemented by the people who run it. That includes police, army, etc. So in countries like Iraq and Lebanon, you see that this thing does not exist. You have the state institution, which in the case of Iraq has been built post the United States intervention, while at the same time there are all these parallel institutions like the PMF, the Hezbollah of Iraq, all of that stuff. And that leads to absolute chaos. And we are now witnessing, in which you have the Iraqi government have publicly said that they don't want to attack any rocket on Israel, while at the same time militias that are controlled by the IRGC and controlled by the Iranian government in most cases are firing rockets. And the Iraq government literally has no ability and no power to stop that. So the first thing is really focusing on building a normal country. And that's why I think it's very important for the West, as well as the regional countries like Saudi Arabia and Emirates, to play a very major role as them being successful state institutions to enhance that. That also includes enforcing the actual UN security resolutions. The UN security resolution 1559, which was adopted by the United Nations in 2004, called for the complete disarmament of all Lebanese militias, and that includes Hezbollah. And now we're kind of in a very interesting time because over the past couple years, and Ahmed will probably attest, is that the United Nations conversation has been mostly about moving to UN Security Resolutions 1701, which is only trying to move Hezbollah beyond the Litani River. But I think now we actually have a chance to implement the first UN Security Resolution in 2004 that calls for the complete dismantling of these militias, both in Iraq and Lebanon. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done on that within already the existing international frameworks that exist. So we don't have to really reinvent the wheel. This conversation has been going on roughly for decades, and I think it's time for us to act. The second most important thing is support for independent civil society. As the tale says, there is no democracy without a civil society and no civil society without democracy. So one of the main things that I know the Free Democratic Party has really supported, and I'm really thankful for that with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and others, is to make sure that these civil society organizations remain independent. One of the challenges that we actually face with so-called NGOs, called the NGO industrial complex that exists in Iraq and Lebanon, is that many of them created, the political parties or the established political parties have created all these so-called fake NGOs. And what they do is that they fulfill whatever the buzzwords that exist in the United Nations that the State Department called for proposals. So if the call for proposals by the State Department is sustainable development goals, empowerment for women, climate change, they will find 100 people. Now they're using ChatGPT, so they're actually kind of expediting the process. Before they need to hire a grant writer, now they're using AI to do it, and get most of the money that actually gets developed in the so-called aid systems to suck most of the money. And that's not only just in Iraq case, that's the case, of course, in Lebanon and so many of these places in which there's now this an entire really political parties NGO complex that is not independent. So it's very important that when we're talking about a real state with a real state of law, then that requires the independent civil society. The other thing which I think that Germany did really good job at is supporting liberal media outlets. I always say, there's actually a very famous Lebanese comedian who said that the Sunnis have Saudi Arabia and the Shias have Iran, and the liberals have nobody but God. He's the son of Fairuz, who's one of the very famous Lebanese musicians. But what I think Germany did a very good at, and that's where Deutsche Welle came into the existence of the Arab media, is that when they started empowering Arab liberals. So now Deutsche Welle, to some extent, is the channel of Arab liberal. They hired Ahmed al-Bashir, who was one of the most famous Iraqi comedians, have given him a big platform. But I think this is still not enough, because one of the challenges that exist in the region, whether it's in Iraq, etc., is that when liberalism is viewed as a Western myth, what is a Western imposed idea, then by default many people are going to have resistance to it. And that's going to happen because of anti-colonial rhetoric, left-wing rhetoric, Islamic rhetoric, etc. So the thing is, I think what is better is that not to expand the bureaucracy of Deutsche Welle, but rather to actually support local media outlets. So that would include, and make sure that these media outlets eventually will have to survive on their own. Because one of the main challenges is that you don't want to create a global welfare state. You don't want to create the system in which, if Germany right now, as what happened in Afghanistan, as we have seen, is that when the moment the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, the entire civil society collapsed. And the reason why it collapsed because the United States aid program have created an entire welfare in which you created entire dependency of all these people within the Afghan government, the civil society, to be entirely like parasites on the US aid system and also the US German system. So I think it's very important that when we're thinking about aid, we're also thinking of it as an investment that has a limited time frame. And we have to communicate that immediately. So in that way, it creates no illusion that the Middle East or the liberal voices in the Middle East have to be dependent entirely on US aid or German aid programs. Which brings me to the very important part, which is the concept of private sector. I know that GIZ and the German government is doing a lot of work in Iraq and Lebanon on strengthening private-public partnerships. Unfortunately, many of this money is also being dragged into a lot of the political parties in Iraq that is taking a lot of that money and providing very little to the private sector. So we as an organization have tried to think of a different model. So we talked with George Mason University, which has a program called Emergent Ventures, which I support everyone to look at. And so we received a grant of $1 million to give you kind of a comparison. The World Bank has done research on the German fund, the American fund, and the British fund, and they found that it costs $20,000 to create one job. That means $1 million can only create 50 jobs using the current aid program. And the reason for that is that the money goes into multiple layers of middlemen giving the other money to contractors, to the way that the money rarely makes it to the people that it intends to help. So what George Mason research, the economist Tyler Cowen has worked on, is that what if we actually give the money directly to private sector enterprise? What if we actually give it to the people who want to create jobs, and with simple vetting systems that you can actually see if the idea has potential, and at the same time, it is various businesses, this is registered, etc. We found that with our system, and we implemented this model with $1 million grant as well, to compare with the World Bank, that it costs only $200 to create a job, not $20,000. And that is you actually give it directly to the people that you intend to help, not to give it to NGO, that give it to another NGO. The Guardian has done a very amazing research that as of now, this is all what we know of. I mean, there's probably going to be 1,000 articles in the next couple of years that there are $16 billion of aid has been stolen in Iraq. 16 billion. Just think about that. I'm sure, and that is just one example. There is actually a lot of examples in the, I mean, as you probably know, the United States, I always say the United States has spent $1 trillion of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all to replace Iraq with Iran and the Taliban with the Taliban. So that tells you the idea of how much of the money that was supposedly spent on these countries have all really been dissipated. And if there are actually any success stories in Iraq, and I go to Iraq almost every year, if you go to downtown Erbil, which is the capital of Kurdistan region of Iraq, or you go to downtown Baghdad, where I'm from, you'll see that most of the progress and most of economic development is actually coming from the private sector. It is not coming from foreign NGOs or local NGOs. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. So that brings me to the fifth point, which is we need accountability systems for these aid programs. I mean, in most cases, I would rather the West doesn't give aid than to give aid that end up being stolen by the political parties of Iraq and Lebanon. I would rather the Germans actually keep their taxes rather than having them stolen in the Middle East. So in a way, because every time I go actually meeting with the State Department officials, etc., they always remind me that the United States has committed hundreds of millions of dollars in Iraq, and I keep telling them what it is, because I don't see it in anyone's bank account except the politicians. So I would rather that the United States get the IRS cuts taxes for the American people than actually use money that gets wasted in bolstering a lot of these corrupt bureaucratic institutions that get built in many of these countries. But if you want to continue giving aid, I would rather it goes through investments, and in that way there is direct benefits between if Germany invests in businesses in Iraq or Lebanon, then Germany benefits, Iraq benefits, and everybody wins. Instead of creating a welfare state, a global welfare state that only creates dependency. Which brings me back to a basic work that Faisal Saeed does, which is it's very important to support liberal political parties and liberal political establishments. These are parties that actually support the values of free markets, free speech. I mean, these are the values that build the West. So why not they cannot build the Middle East as well? We always think of these ideas as that, oh, well, the West can have free speech and free markets, but the Middle East, no, they're very different than us. Well, what worked here is worked there as well. And we're seeing it when the Kurdistan regional government of Iraq has implemented a private sector advancement. Now you're seeing a lot of businesses pop up, and the economy of the Kurdistan region is doing much better than it is for the rest of the region. So it tells you that these ideas work no matter where you put them. When you reduce bureaucracies, when you reduce barriers for people to start a business, to actually have an agency over their own future, they're number one, more likely to stay, which I know Germany is dealing with the refugee crisis after refugee crisis. It's very important that, most importantly, the skilled people, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, need to stay in their countries. They don't need to escape for a better place, because if all of the entrepreneurs and innovators escape, you have nobody left to build these countries. So it's very important that the way I look at the private sector, I look at aid, is that's one of the best ways to stop the brain drain. So in that way, many of these people stay there. And then finally, which I think is a very important, and that touches on pretty much all of the region, and Iran in particular, is that it's very much important to ensure free and uncensored internet access. As you probably know, during the Iran Revolution and during the Iraq Tashrin protest, the first thing the government did in Iraq was shut down the internet, and therefore shut down all forms of communication between many of the protesters, many of the civil society organizations, and everybody that is working there. And the great thing now is that there's technology that can do that. I'm very sure many of you who follow Elon Musk will know that there is now a new Starlink that is literally the size of a small iPad that can give people roughly 100 megabytes internet per second anywhere in the world. So you can be in a mountain in Tanzania, which I have because I don't know what I was doing there, but so we can go from all the way there to mountains of Kurdistan, to the rivers and across Baghdad, and you can get high-speed internet that is uncensored, and therefore you can access social media, you can access messaging apps, and there's a reason why this government shut it down, is because they don't want the civil society to organize, and they don't want it to have the power it does. Which we are seeing now. Yesterday with Axel Springer, I went to an event about China. I mean, China does a lot of work in monitoring a lot of talks, and that way they can prevent the next revolution. I'm happy to say that many of the things that I've talked on is something that my organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, have worked on, and we'll have a lot to share in terms of the good, bad, and the ugly, to quote the famous American movie. And if you have any questions, our website is Ideas Beyond Borders. You can email us at hello@ideasbeyondborders, or you can talk to me anytime you want. Thank you very much.